Everybody sure does love talking about the Aeons, but I guess that makes sense. They're basically gods, and who doesn't love talking about and analyzing these seemingly all-powerful and incomprehensible deities that have such enormous sway over mortal lives? I have seen countless write-ups and videos going over each Aeon's history and breaking down the philosophical viewpoints that they represent, but I haven't seen much discussion about the Gnostic origins of the Aeons, which surprises me because I feel like there's stuff we can learn from there. So obviously I went down that road, and I ended up getting stuck on one thing in particular. You see, all Gnostic Aeons come in pairs, so I had to ask the question, do Star Rail's Aeons come in pairs too? So I decided to try and pair up every Aeon in Star Rail that we know about, and in doing so, I discovered that there is one key difference between the Gnostic Aeons and Star Rail's Aeons. While Gnostic Aeon pairings complement each other, Star Rail's Aeons are opposites of each other. And through analyzing these opposing relationships, I think I've managed to solve a few mysteries surrounding the Aeons and their paths, especially with regards to Ho'o, Qlipoth, Nanook, and Akavili. But before we start, I just want to remind you that I put timestamps and citations in the description box if you need them, and you can also find a link down there to the Red Magic 9S Pro gaming phone, who is the sponsor of today's video and an excellent solution to all your mobile gaming needs. The ability to have a smooth gaming experience is a key consideration when shopping for a new phone, especially these days since the quality of mobile games rivals that of console games, and all of that improved graphical fidelity and the need for increased frame rates requires some serious hardware. And that's where the Red Magic 9S Pro comes in, because this phone was designed to handle the latest and greatest of mobile gaming. It's got a beautiful 120Hz OLED edge-to-edge screen with high pixel resolution for sharp and colorful gameplay, with a hidden front-facing camera so it doesn't get in your way. But to make this display really shine, you're gonna need some powerful hardware. Which is why the Red Magic 9S Pro doesn't just have the best of the best Snapdragon 8 Generation 3 processor, but also has a second processor that's exclusively dedicated to gaming, which means you get a much smoother experience while you're playing. Now, you'd think a phone like this would run pretty hot, but you can kiss those sweaty palms goodbye because this phone has better cooling technology than my desktop PC does. Between the heat sinks and these super quiet fans, the phone runs really cool. And this has another really important benefit when it comes to battery life. Because while most phones have fast charging these days, and the Red Magic 9S Pro does too, of course, the problem is that the faster you charge your phone, the more heat gets generated, and that can decrease your battery's lifespan really quick. But this powerful built-in cooling system helps reduce the internal temperature while charging, which keeps your battery in good condition for a long, long time. And there are so many more features to love, like this ultra-rare headphone jack, or the customizable built-in shoulder triggers, plus some really nice quality of life stuff like this really nice form factor and completely flat back. And you get all this at a really great price. So if you happen to be looking for a new phone, check out the link in the description box for more information on the Red Magic 9S Pro. I genuinely love this phone, and I think you will too. Thanks once again to the Red Magic 9S Pro gaming phone for sponsoring this video. And now, back to our theory. Alright, so as of time of recording, there are 18 known Aeons in Star Rail. And wow, what a very conveniently even number in a video all about pairing up things. Except it's not actually an even number at all, because while we have 18 names of Aeons, there are currently only 17 paths. This is important because an Aeon cannot exist without a path, but paths can and do exist without Aeons. So while Aeons are the focus here, what happens with an Aeon's path ends up mattering more than what happened to the Aeon themselves. I say this because we have 3 cases where an Aeon died and left behind a masterless path. We have Akavili, Long, and Adrilla. These seem to be cases where the Aeon was killed while leaving their paths unaffected, meaning that people can still walk the paths of those Aeons even when those Aeons aren't around anymore. Now, I am not counting Tazeroth here, even though they are also marked as dead, because as far as we can tell, they were just sealed in Qlipoth's amber, so their status is kind of questionable. Now, on the other hand, Enna's death is the reason why we only have 17 Aeons to pair up instead of the expected 18. See, Enna is the only instance where an Aeon's path has literally fused with another path. This means that Order and Harmony are now the same path because Xipe's path of Harmony consumed Enna's path of the Order, which means that unlike Long, Akavili, Adrilla, and arguably Tazeroth, Enna's death did not leave behind a masterless path. Xipe just governs over both paths as if they were a single path, because they are now. The way I understand it is that paths are like philosophies or concepts, so the idea here is that Harmony is a broader concept concept that includes order, while order is a subsect of the concept of harmony. I really hope that wasn't too confusing, because the main point that I was trying to make is that because Enna and Xipe's paths fuse together, we're left with only 17 total paths and eons to work with, and not 18, despite multiple eons being dead. And this number might bother the math lovers out there because it's pretty hard to create pairs out of an odd number. Now, fortunately, there's a very simple solution to this, and that is that one eon is a pair with itself. One eon that I don't see anyone talk about all that much is Ho'o, the equilibrium. But this eon is actually the reason why I wanted to make this theory in the first place. Firstly, they are one of the oldest eons, and they are responsible for separating concepts and splitting all beings into interchangeable duality. Legend says that they were originally one entity that split itself into two, then melded itself back together as two concepts acting as one. Good and evil, happiness and sadness, love and hate. For every positive, there is a negative, and thus equilibrium is achieved, but only through duality. And since they were originally a singular entity that split itself into two and then merged itself back together to act as one but still is two separate deities, I think it's safe to say that Ho'o is paired with itself. Ho with O. And I also suspect that they might be responsible for all the pairings that follow this section, because that's technically their primum mobile, or their path. And if you think about how their ultimate goal is to ensure that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, to put it in Newtonian terms, then it's not that far-fetched to think that Ho'o might be responsible for some rather, let's just call them strategic, ascensions into eonhood. Which means that should someone ascend to eonhood on their own, I think Ho'o would eventually meddle with things until an eon of the opposite path ascended to counter them. Well, that's the general idea anyway. And also the reason why Ho'o is paired with themselves. They've gotta hold themselves to their own standards, or else they're going against their path and they can't do that because they're an eon, so yeah. But with that in mind, let's take a look at the remaining 16 eons and their paths and see if we can't keep Ho'o's scales in perfect balance. Our first pairing is very straightforward. It's the hunt and the abundance. Obviously, we can point to the Luofu's whole story about how Yaosha, the abundance, was running amok and causing chaos and suffering with their gifts of everlasting life. So much suffering, in fact, that Lan actually ascended as a result of Yaosha's meddling to become the hunt, the one that would forever hunt the denizens of abundance. Because eternal life can't just run around unchecked. To balance Ho'o's scales, you gotta have some death in there. So Lan's ascension created this balanced relationship of predator and prey, which you can see even emphasized in their designs. Yaosha has antlers like a deer, while Lan has the bow of a hunter. And you can also think of their relationship as that of life and death. Life should never persist forever, it needs death. But death has no meaning without life, so I feel like these two kind of ended up with the most codependent relationship out of all of the eons. This pair feels pretty straightforward, so I'm not really going to try to justify it beyond what I've already done. Next up is another easy one, the erudition and the enigmata. Just like with Lan and Yaosha, Mythos was born as a response to Noos's pursuit of knowledge, as a means to counter it. See, Noos ascended because of a desire to know everything and to understand everything, but Mythos believed that no one should be able to do that, and mystery and uncertainty was what opened up possibilities for a new future. Some things aren't meant to be known or understood, but it's also the case that not everything should be unknown or unclear, so these two definitely balance each other out. Next up is the propagation and the veracity. Now, despite Ouroboros having a lot of beef with Qlipoth on account of Ouroboros being a Leviathan and Qlipoth hating the Leviathans, and even going so far as to build the Echidna Skywall to keep them out, their concepts don't actually match. Veracity isn't the opposite or counter to the concept of the preservation of things. Like, I'm sure there's a way to make this work, but they both have better options. And in Ouroboros' case, the better option is Tayzeranth. See, the path of veracity is the path of hunger and consumption, and I don't know about you, but if I were infinitely hungry, I would want to be around something that produced an infinite amount of food, and that's exactly what Tayzeranth does. They produce an infinite amount of swarm beetles that Ouroboros can eat. Now, their purpose is not to be eaten, but you know, it's not like Yaosha's initial purpose was to die to Lan, so I don't really think that's a problem. And either way, we actually got to witness this relationship during the swarm disaster story, because Ouroboros attacked Tayzeranth very early on, swallowing countless swarm beetles and even entire worlds in the process. Their conflict was legendary, and was also what inspired the other eons to get involved and put a stop to the whole mess. Anyway, moving on to the next one, which I matched in a bit of a weird way. I speak, of course, of the match between nihility and beauty. So during a conversation on Discord, a bunch of channel members were discussing how interesting it was that Acheron and Argenti were the only two units thus far who had unique functionality behind their use of energy for their ultimates. Acheron rejected the use of energy entirely, opting instead to use debuff stacks, while Argenti embraced the use of energy to the point where he almost has two different ults. They kind of felt like opposites. Now we know that Acheron is an emanator of nihility and that Argenti follows the path of beauty. So some folks started to wonder if Argenti might also be an emanator of beauty, because you gotta admit that this guy has pulled off some incredible feats for the average Pathstrider. Like, he blew up a giant swarm beetle in space on his own, and he also saved a Venturi from Acheron's nihility backrooms, and that's just to name a couple of the most recent baffling examples. But regardless of whether or not he is an emanator, this did get me wondering about why the game would hint at nihility and beauty as being opposing forces. And actually, what the heck is this path of beauty even supposed to be? How does one ascend to Eonhood because of liking pretty things or wanting everything to be pretty? And that's when I realized that that's exactly what that was. The path of beauty is being able to see the beauty of everything, even the things that are ugly or horrible or bad. Like, everything has a purpose, everything has a meaning, and in that we find beauty. It's the beauty of life and existence. And when you think of it this way, you can really see why beauty would run counter to the philosophy of nihility, because nihility thinks that nothing matters. Everything is pointless. Why even exist? Why try? Why not let the clock run down and just disappear? And these opposing philosophies are exactly what we see mirrored with Acheron and Argenti, although Acheron does resist nihility's call. Can't really blame her for that. But still, if there is a path that claims that nothing matters, so nihility, then there must be a path that claims that everything matters, and that's beauty. Now, the pairings only get trickier from here on out. Like, why would I claim that permanence is the opposite of remembrance? I mean, they seem pretty similar, on the surface maybe. So here's my logic. Long walked the path of permanence, but in spite of the path being outright called immortality or eternity in Chinese, Long did not believe in eternal life, which I found very confusing. So I was trying to figure out what the point of permanence even was when we already had abundance, which grants immortality. Like, sure, we have some overlap when it comes to the philosophies of the eons and the paths, but we don't have anything that's like straight up identical like this. And that's when I realized that Long actually believed in the permanence of the physical form. Not to say that the body of a mortal can't change, but that the stuff that makes up the body, that which walks in the physical realm, should remain eternal in the physical realm. Which might be why Long's scions like the Vidyadhara reincarnate by having their bodies melt down and reset their whole life and their whole existence. In this way, they are eternally existing in the physical plane, but are not immortal beings. Maybe that's a severe leap of logic. I don't know, but it's the only thing that really makes sense to me, because otherwise I don't really know what this path is. So assuming I've interpreted this correctly, then I think the opposite of preserving the physicality of something is to preserve the memory of something, since memory implies the lack of a physical form, and that just so happens to be what Fuli is doing with their path of remembrance. I guess you could think of it as like body and mind, or mass and information, if we want to go the physics route. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe it's just the material versus the immaterial. I don't know if you can tell, but this is the pairing I was least confident in. In fact, I only landed here through process of elimination because I had pairs for everything else that worked really well. Maybe we'll get some more information in the future and I'll change my mind. I don't know, but this is where I am for right now. And speaking of lack of confidence, Aha's Path of Elation feels mislabeled to me. Not by the translation team, but by the people in the game itself. Like, exactly what part of this eon inspires joy or happiness? I do not understand. So then why did I decide to pair Aha's Path of Elation with Xipe's Path of Harmony? Well, instead of taking the word elation literally, I decided to look at what Aha does instead. And what Aha does is cause chaos wherever they or their followers go. Just for the heck of it. Just because it's fun and entertaining. By their logic, the world's already a disastrous mess, so who cares if it gets messed up a little bit more? If everything's gonna be terrible, you may as well enjoy yourself, so if it's entertaining, then anything goes. Now, thinking of elation in terms of chaos made finding a pair a whole lot easier, because the path of order is like right there. And order is obviously the opposite of chaos. But remember, order was absorbed by the path of harmony, which means that the opposite of elation is harmony. which sounds really weird, I know, but think of it like this. Imagine Aha is like a child smashing piano keys randomly and laughing loudly just for the sake of making noise, because they're bored. Now picture Shippei with that same piano, but instead playing a beautiful melody without a single note out of place. So I guess it's not so much order and chaos, but harmony and discord. And I'm pretty happy with this pairing. Moving on, we have our second to last pairing, which is the preservation and destruction, which sounds pretty straightforward when you first hear it, but when I started to think about it a little bit more while writing this, I got a little bit confused. Cause there's not really any beef between Qlipoth and Nanook. Actually, Qlipoth seems to have most of the beef with Ouroboros. So why would Qlipoth and Nanook be opposites then? They don't ever really interact. And I don't really feel like destruction is the opposite of preservation. Like if you went out on the street and asked anybody what was the opposite of destruction, they'd probably answer creation. And preservation is not creation. So when I was looking at the options for what could run opposite to Nanook, I thought about Enna again. So order versus destruction, which I realize also doesn't make a lot of sense at first glance, but Nanook is called the quote avatar of entropy, and entropy is basically the quote gradual decline into disorder, which is why I thought it was the opposite of order and disorder. But I also don't necessarily think that entropy is the opposite of harmony, and harmony swallowed order, so I gave up on the idea and decided to dig a little bit deeper. And in doing so, I realized that the behavior of Nanook and Qlipoth is just weird. They're alike in that they ignore each other and just go about doing whatever it is that they do, and they're both doing weird things that seem to have nothing to do with their path. For example, Nanook is seeding the universe with stellarons, which aren't exactly little balls of destruction, although they can kind of help with that a little bit. But what stellarons actually appear to be doing is granting the wishes of the people who come in contact with them. And while Qlipoth is building a wall, as you would do if you wanted to preserve something, they have some abilities that are just bizarre, and not at all what you would expect from something that is the embodiment of preservation. Now, the most egregious example of this happened during the Swarm disaster when Qlipoth stripped Tazeronth of their shell, body, and heart, then extracted their concept, whatever the heck that means, which further diluted Tazeronth's power until they began to disintegrate. How the heck is that a power of preservation? It's not, because Qlipoth's power has nothing to do with preservation. See, according to Enna, Qlipoth is actually the, quote, one that controls the will of transmutation. It's this line that made me realize that Qlipoth is actually the power of conservation, as in the conservation laws in physics. Allow me to explain using thermodynamics, which is part of the laws of conservation. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it can only be converted from one form into another. So as an example, if you had 10 units of energy type A, you can convert that into 10 units of energy type B and still have 10 units of energy total. If we think of this conversion as transmutation, then Enna's words start to make sense. Qlipoth is basically the manifestation of the process of the conversion or transmutation of energy, and in this way, he's helping to preserve the universe. I bet a lot of you are really confused right now, but this is where Nanook comes in, because there's one thing that really screws with the laws of thermodynamics, and that is entropy. And Nanook is the avatar of entropy, but to understand why this is, you're gonna need to know what entropy even is. So in the context of conservation laws, entropy is the energy that is wasted during energy conversion. Because realistically, if you were to convert energy from type A to type B, then some energy would be wasted in the process of this conversion. I'm using the term wasted very specifically because energy is not lost during this conversion process because energy can't be destroyed. Instead, it is wasted. To explain what I mean using the same example from last time, if I take those 10 units of energy A and try to convert them into energy B, there's likely a cost of, say, 2 units of energy in order to kickstart the conversion process. So I can only convert 10 units of energy A into 8 units of energy B with 2 units of waste left over. That means I still have a total of 10 energy, but I didn't get a perfect conversion. Now, as a general rule, entropy within the universe is constantly increasing over time, which means that we are constantly generating energy waste. This process will eventually result in the heat death of the universe. In other words, total destruction. You can actually see this in Simulated Universe if you choose the destruction path and get some resonance going. And now Nanook makes a bit more sense. See, they're not out there actively destroying things and wrecking havoc like you would expect something that embodies destruction to do. They're accelerating the universe's inevitable destruction through the use of stellarons, which I realize sounds crazy, until you realize that human activity massively increases thermodynamic entropy within the universe. Now think about what a stellaron does, because it's not actually a weapon of destruction, it's a star that grants the wishes of people. And what better way to accelerate the heat death of the universe than by seeding the universe with little entropy bombs that basically grant the wishes of life forms that greatly increase entropy. And now Kafka's words about how we'll have to face Nanook at the end of our journey makes a lot more sense. The Trailblazer is a walking ball of entropy, walking slowly towards the heat death of the universe. And when you think of things this way, Qlipoth's attempts at isolating planets might be a way for him to create controlled environments where there's minimal waste, thereby creating regions of low entropy, which should slow Nanook down a bit. And perhaps the Echidna Skywall, which Qlipoth is presumably building in order to keep out the Leviathans, is there to prevent another Dusk War, which would also probably increase entropy by a lot if it happened again. So there you have it. Qlipoth is all about wasteless energy conversion, which therefore helps preserve the lifespan of the universe, while Nanook is increasing waste so that the universe catches on fire and destroys itself, which kind of sounds a lot like climate change, which is depressing. But with that, we're down to our final pairing, which I guess also isn't much of a mystery since we've already paired the rest of them. So here we go. We've got the Trailblaze and Finality. Now, I think the Trailblaze isn't quite the right word to describe the scope of Akaveli's path, and I'll tell you why I think that. The Nameless are on a never-ending journey, witnessing the world and all the stories within it, but the point of this isn't to travel, but to experience. And to experience the world is to observe time while traveling through space. Which means that, yes, I am proposing that the Trailblaze is actually the path of space-time instead. And how I got there is a little bit convoluted, so stick with me. In Penacony, we met Misha, who was naturally gifted when it came to repairing clocks, so skilled that later in life he earned himself the title of the Watchmaker. But he always dreamed of traveling like his parents, so one day he boarded the Astral Express and became one of its Nameless. Now, through an odd twist of fate, Misha ended up repairing a pocket watch that the current navigator couldn't fix, and this impressed the navigator so much that he appointed Misha the mechanic of the train. Now, I might not need to say this, but there is an enormous gap of knowledge between how the mechanics of a clock and a train work. Watchmakers don't usually repair trains. That's just not how it works. Unless your train is a clock, which I think might be the case, because why else would a navigator look at a repaired pocket watch and somehow know that Misha could maintain a train, unless the train is a clock? And to further this point, let's not forget that Clocky's powers were based on that of the Trailblaze. So fixing a clock is equated to fixing the train, and the Trailblaze path can manifest as a little clock dude, which can then tune people's emotions into one of 4 directions? That's a little suspicious. And sure, okay, some of you might point out that Clocky's real name was Compassy, which isn't a clock at all, except it kind of is. Because the point of a compass is to tell you where you are or what direction you're going in. And when it comes to seafaring navigation, a clock does exactly that. Allow me to introduce you to John Harrison, the inventor of the marine chronometer, which was supposed to be a device used to solve the problem of calculating longitude while at sea. Now, the sea part is important because longitude over land could be calculated by measuring the difference in time between 2 distant locations. These days, we do this by syncing one clock to noon in Greenwich, then taking that clock to another location and seeing what time the clock displays when the sun strikes noon in that new location. That difference tells us where we are based on longitude. Now, this was a huge challenge at sea because the movement of the ship would mess with any clocks brought on board, and they would lose hours or even days at a time. And sometimes they just stopped working altogether. And having the wrong time meant that your calculations would place you at the wrong longitude, and that would mean that your navigator would put you on the wrong part of the map. And I don't think I have to explain why that's a big deal, especially when you're at sea, because there aren't really any other landmarks. It's just water in every direction for miles and miles and miles and miles. Your equipment has to be perfect. And John Harrison, through many, many iterations, was eventually able to design a clock no larger than the span of a person's hand that could keep perfect time at sea. And that meant less ships getting lost at sea. And this combined theme of clocks and sailing is the basis of Misha's character. See, Misha was born on the oceanic world of Lusaka, which was understandably full of sailors. And that's where he learned how to repair clocks, which was likely a necessary skill because clocks were used to calculate longitude at sea, which is a necessity on a planet that's entirely sea, or mostly sea. Now you put that boy in space, and I suppose you could say he was cruising on the stellar sea, but on a train instead of a boat. Still, same rules apply. You're navigating space by calculating time. Why a train instead of a ship, though? Well, I think it's because a train needs to run on schedule. Like, when I think of a stereotypical train conductor, I think of someone who is always checking their pocket watch. And if the silver rails of the Astral Express are representative of the path of the Trailblaze, that's basically allowing people to traverse space and time freely, then the opposite of that would be the train station, where all movement stops. And to me, that is finality, the train station. And again, this idea is not that far-fetched. See, Terminus is an eon that's moving backwards through time, or so they say. They also say that Terminus has seen the end of time itself and thus appears to be moving backwards. But in my opinion, finality is not the end because everything also originates from finality. It's almost like the beginning and the end form a type of singularity, a moment where time and space just aren't there, or perhaps a moment wherein everything exists all at once so everything can be perceived at the same time, which would run counter to the Trailblaze being the linear experience of space and time. To reuse the analogy, the path of the Trailblaze are the rails of the train, which means finality is the train station, the place where the train goes at the end of the day, and the place where the train leaves from every morning, which also paints a very interesting relationship between the Celeron hunters and the Nameless. But that's a theory for another time, I think. Oh boy, it does feel good to finally have this theory out of my head because it's been sitting there for a while. And I totally didn't write this whole thing down just so I could have an excuse to talk a little bit about the history of the longitude problem or John Harrison's chronometer. And I'm totally not recommending that you guys go check out this awesome movie on Harrison's clocks that A&E made because it's totally not one of my favorite period dramas and it's certainly not educational. Okay, I'm not fooling anybody. I like this movie a weird amount and no one I know seems to know about it, and that is a damn shame. So if you're into this kind of thing, please go check it out. I promise it's really good and you're gonna learn something about clocks and ships and European politics, and I am not selling this thing very well, am I? Okay, well maybe you won't watch Longitude, but hey, you made it all the way through this video, so thanks for that. I really appreciate the support of both you and all my glorious budding scholars that are on screen right now. But now I'm just gonna skedaddle before I start talking about chronometers again, so until next time, buckaroos, I'll see you around.